and to ever more elaborate forms of it, entailing extensive archival work, the setting up of interdisciplinary research centers, and the pursuit of cross-institutional collaborations. As he presents the choice, it might seem rather obvious why many were choosing the side that Hillis Miller disapproved of for, quote, history, culture, society, politics, institutions, class and gender conditions, comma, the social context, comma, the material base, unquote, sound rather more interesting as a field of study than, as Miller phrased it, quote, an orientation toward language as such, unquote, stop. Essentially deconstructed literary theory believed that students should study literariness itself rather than literature, that is the process of the conceptualization of meaning in general rather than the specific meanings of, for example, Middlemarch. In practice, it has always been very difficult to translate this notion of, quote, literariness itself, unquote, into a viable undergraduate curriculum, and all those elephantine literary theory, quote, readers, unquote, merely demonstrate that this is so. Likewise, striving for, quote, an orientation towards language as such, unquote, is a bit like trying to look at the sun in literary studies. You can't do it for long, it can be damaging, and you very quickly want to look elsewhere. Studying history, culture, gender conditions, and the rest is much more concrete, and translating that range of interest into a syllabus which students would want to follow isn't such a difficult task. Page 275. So the turning of the tide away from deconstruction and towards historicism was not really a surprising trend. But what exactly we need to ask at this point is the difference between historicism and history. Well, a historian might seek through diligent research to recover the past and enable us to walk again the streets of Shakespeare's London, making for the playhouse to see a performance of Hamlet. We will know how the streets looked, smell the smells, hear the sounds, and know what coins exactly we need to have in our hands in order to get into the theatre. So the turning of the tide away from deconstruction and towards historicism was not really a surprising trend. But what exactly we need to ask at this point is the difference between historicism and history. Well, a historian might seek through diligent research to recover the past and enable us to walk again the streets of Shakespeare's London, making for the playhouse to see a performance of Hamlet. We will know how the streets looked, smell the smells, hear the sounds, and know what coins exactly we need to have in our hands in order to get into the theatre. Parenthesis. This is Stephen's intellectual fantasy in the Scylla, S-C-Y-L-L-A, and Charybdis, C-H-A-R-Y-B-D-I-S, unquote, Scylla, quote, section of Joyce's Ulysses, of course. These, notice, are external material things representative of what historical research uncovers. The ultimate end of such inquiry might be the Bankside Globe in London, an Elizabethan theatre as authentic as we can make it, where we can now go and have an approximation of that experience, standing in the open air as the groundlings did, and even hearing the sounds of English as the Elizabethans heard them, if the performance we attend is in, quote, old pronunciation, unquote. Parenthesis, of course, you have to be able to ignore the constant noise of jets flying into Heathrow, parenthesis closes, stop. But historians don't really like enterprises like the Bankside Globe because in the end such external material things are not their goal. Historians are interested in internal things. They are less interested in what the Elizabethans saw in the theatre than in how it felt to see what Elizabethans saw there. They are interested too in what we call quote, identities, unquote, including, quote, early modern identities, unquote, comma, quote, gender identities, unquote, and, quote, national identities, unquote, dash. That is to say, not mere external and material things, but something deeper which suffuses or transcends the material fabric of the era. Quote, who cares, unquote, comma, I can hear them say, comma, quote, what kind of shirts the Elizabethans wore, comma, or how they pronounced English, dash, I want to understand how it felt to be Elizabethan, unquote, stop. So historicists are primarily interested in discourses within quote, comma, quote, structures of feeling, unquote, comma, mindsets within quote, comma, and identities within quote, comma, and they seem to me much more confident than real historians usually are that such fundamental and yet intangible elements of the past are recoverable. Unlike historians, historicists want to go straight to the identity level without all the boring archaeological sped work that historians spend most of their time doing. Page 276. Quote, historians are always materialists, comma, historicists are always idealists, unquote, comma, as Maurice Zapp, ZAPP, the literary theorist hero of David Lodge's novels, would have said. Hillis Miller, I think, ignores the distinction between historians and historicists in his address and sees the opposing force of historicism as representing just a kind of Gradgrindian, Gradgrindian interest in facts, and he naturally cannot understand how that could compete in interest with the fascination of, quote, language as such, unquote, stop. As I read this sixth event, then it is symptomatic of the moment when theory's enormous and rapid success began to induce a certain complacency. Its huge impact at highly privileged institutions in the UK and the USA caused it both to underestimate the appeal of other approaches and overestimate the likely intellectual shelf life of its own ideas. Section. The Strathclyde University, quote, Linguistics of Writing, unquote, Conference, 1986, indent, reading. The, quote, book of the conference, unquote, is The Linguistics of Writing, colon, Arguments Between Language and Literature, ed. Nigel Fabb, FABB, comma, Derek Attridge, ATTRIDGE, comma, Alan Durant, and Colleen McCabe. Manchester University Press, 1987. A TV documentary film about the event called Big Words, Small Worlds was written and presented by David Lodge and broadcast on Channel 4 on 22 November 1987. Indent closes para. The sense that literary theory was perhaps becoming a little complacent again seemed in evidence when a high-profile conference on literary theory took place in Glasgow in the summer of 1987, with many of the most prominent theorists as speakers. In retrospect, the conference seems both the point when theory reached the height of its glamour and success, and at the same time the beginning of the era when a certain triumphalism began to provoke dissent and resistance, which wasn't just coming from die-hard traditionalists. I think of that event now as being rather like the British Labour Party's infamous, quote, Sheffield rally, unquote, which was a political convention mounted just before the general election of 1992, when Labour was well ahead in the polls. Unfortunately, the rally came across on TV as a premature victory celebration before any victory had been achieved. The poll lead evaporated and the result for the Labour Party was another 5 years in opposition. The same air of triumphal, page 277. Celebration was in evidence at Strathclyde, curiously mixed with an attempt to revive the prestige of linguistics, for the conference was organized by the program in literary linguistics at Strathclyde University and sought to repeat and recreate the impact of the legendary, quote, Conference on Style, unquote, at Indiana in 1958, the first theory event discussed here. So in reference back to the Indiana conference, this one opened with a quote, closing statement unquote, and closed with an opening statement as if confident that it was setting in motion a whole new era of theory. Yet the sessions were not always distinguished. Several of the famous linguists seemed very monodisciplinary to me, and they were in that sense a step backwards from the evangelistic interdisciplinarity of Indiana. David Lodge, at the start of his lecture on Bakhtin, reminded us that one of the Indiana sessions had been a densely statistical and tabular paper on stylistic deviations in suicide notes, and as it went on, the Glasgow conference began to seem more and more like a lengthy suicide note for literary theory. Para. Derrida gave his lecture, quote, How to Avoid Speaking, unquote, a particularly taxing and relentless address on negative theology, which lasted, as I recall, for nearly 2 hours, the last half hour of which was constantly punctuated by the sound of the lecture theatre doors opening and closing as members of the audience left the auditorium in exhaustion. This lecture is not in the book of the conference, I think, because Derrida had already promised it elsewhere, but he also gave a question and answer session which is included in the book as, quote, some questions and responses, unquote, pages 252 to 264. The format for this session was that questions had been written out the day before and handed to the chairperson, who passed them on to Derrida, giving him time to consider his response. At the event, each question was read out by the chair, and then Derrida responded, not from extensive written notes, so far as I could tell, but anyway with the benefit of prior consideration, making it similar in feel to a present-day interview conducted by email. My memories of this session are firstly of Derrida's wit and charm, and secondly of the way he startled his audience by announcing that he had never said or thought that the metaphysics of presence was evil, quote, I am inclined to think exactly the contrary, that it's good, unquote, page 257. It took some minutes for people to take in the implications of what had been said. If the metaphysics of presence is good, page 278, why spend a whole career seeking to deconstruct it?